Hi everybody, it's very exciting to welcome you to today's webinar, Transition to School or Readiness for School, What's the Difference and Why Does It Matter? The webinar is brought to you by ARACY's Early Years chapter. As stated, I'm Fran Press and I'm a New South Wales rep on that Early Years chapter. This webinar is reaching across the more than 500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations that make up contemporary Australia. We therefore would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all those countries and pay our respects to their elders past, present and future. Wherever you are in Australia today, you may wish to make your own acknowledgement of country to the traditional owners and elders of the land on which you're currently standing. Today at this webinar we're hearing from Sue Dockett, who's a professor in early childhood education at Charles Sturt University, and she's based in Albury. With colleagues, as many of you will know, she has spent almost 20 years exploring educational transitions, particularly the transition to school. The recent Continuity of Learning resource is an example of her recent publications in this area. I'll now hand over to Sue to kick off her presentation.
Okay, well, welcome everybody, and it's great to know that there are a whole range of people out there who are interested in talking about transition to school. Thank you to the ARACY people, and thank you to Fran for that useful introduction. Today I want to talk about transition to school and readiness to school and promote some conversation about what might be the difference and why it might matter. Seems a fairly opportune time to do that at the moment, because now is about the time of year we start to get questions from a whole range of people, from parents, from educators, from communities in a sense. Often, and the question is, is this child ready for school? My question to you today is to think about, well, what we might answer to that and what sorts of issues might underlie those sorts of questions. But it's also to ask you to think about what else we might consider when we're having those discussions about readiness. So my plan for today is to try and cover a range of things. To start some thinking about readiness, to ask some questions that we may not get a chance to answer in this session, but to start the conversations about them. But who needs to be ready? Ready for what, and what it might mean to be ready? And then I want to turn our thinking to notions of transition. And for me and the team I work with, most of those questions come around the issues of continuity and change. And then we also have a lot to think about in terms of relationship building. So they're the sorts of things that I'd like to explore in today's session. Hopefully you'll also participate through your questions, and it might be the start of some ongoing conversations and discussions. As we go through this session, there are some questions that I'd like you to think about. I suspect that we won't have a chance to answer all of these in today's sessions, but these are the sorts of conversation starters or questions that I'd really encourage you to think about. I'd like you to think about what we mean by readiness and whose readiness is assessed. I'd like you to think about how we might assess readiness. In that same vein, to think about who performs well and who performs poorly on measures of readiness. How does this affect our expectations around transition? Really specifically, I'd like you to think about whether or not the measures of readiness we use are designed to promote inclusion or exclusion. So if we're thinking about children starting school, are measures of readiness a way to include children in educational contexts, or are they ways of excluding? And then to think about how readiness might contribute to experiences of transition. And I'm sure you'll have lots of experience and questions to share, and that could be part of, as I said, some nice ongoing conversations. So I'm just going to keep rolling on and hope that this is making sense as I go through. There's a fair bit of research around now, and a lot of it comes from the US as well as from Australia, that school readiness is a multi-dimensional concept, that it incorporates several major components. Perhaps the one we're most familiar with is that notion of children's readiness for school. But we also know there's a fairly important body of work that points to schools' readiness for children, and the third element being the capacity of families and communities to provide the necessary opportunities, conditions and supports to optimise children's development and learning. And sometimes you see this encapsulated in the readiness equation, if you like. And the readiness equation often says things like ready families plus ready early childhood services plus ready communities plus ready schools equals ready children. And in some ways that equation is a nice reminder that we're talking about bigger and broader issues here than just what it is that children can or can't do. I'm going to spend a little bit of time unpacking those elements before we talk about transition. We're probably all fairly familiar with the notion of children's readiness for school. And we often look at that in terms of developmental domains. Sometimes we look at what's called essential learning skills, or sometimes executive skills that take into account things like self-regulation and children's dispositions. Sometimes we talk about children's readiness for school in terms of the outcomes of the EYLF. Sometimes we talk about readiness for school in terms of school entry assessments and how children perform on those. What we have found in the research that we've been doing, as Fran said, for a long time, is that in the last few years there's been an increased focus from teachers in particular on the importance of children's skills. So we see teachers and hear teachers mentioning more than perhaps 10 years ago about the importance of things like self-help skills, fine motor skills. Things like, can children look after their own belongings? Can they hold a pencil properly? And often these sorts of skills are the focus of readiness checklists and a range of different information that's put out there for parents in terms of assessing children's readiness for school. So children's readiness for school clearly is important, and much of our conversation around starting school often focuses on what it is that children bring to the situation. There are some challenges in assessing children's readiness. Many of you who work with young children know incredibly well that children of a common age are still incredibly diverse. So there's great diversity of children as they start school. And in fact, from my own experience, one of the great delights about being a teacher in early childhood is that kids are so different. And one of the questions is to look at how that diversity might be a challenge in assessing children's readiness. Another challenge is whether we look at one-off assessments or cumulative assessments. When is it that we make our judgments about children's readiness, and on what basis? The other bit of interesting and consistent research that's coming out of the US is basically questioning things like skills assessments and saying that many of the preschool skills assessments that are around are actually quite poor predictors of children's school adjustment and achievement. In fact, they've demonstrated that after a couple of years, there's really not a very strong relationship at all between those preschool assessments and how kids are doing in school. So perhaps one of the best known parts of that readiness equation is about looking at children's readiness, but it's not all of the picture. It's also important to look at what I've called family readiness. And that's essentially looking at how each family supports children's learning. Sometimes that's reduced to talking about the home learning environment. How many books are there in the environment at home? How often do parents read to children? And then they're particularly important. But some of the EPI work from the UK is telling us that it's not just the resources that families have, it's actually the dispositions and the approaches that families use to encourage education that are particularly important. So you can have a home learning environment that may not have many resources, but where parents and siblings and grandparents are incredibly keen to promote children's learning and development. And that can be a really, really important element of the home learning environment. We also, when we're looking at family readiness, need to have that really strong recognition that the family is itself an educational environment. Children don't just start learning when they come to school, or even don't just start learning when they come to early childhood settings. The family is the main and primary educational and context for very young children, and how we might recognise that in our consideration of readiness is important. And the other element there I've listed there is that it's not just about the education focus that we know makes a difference for children. We know that children's health and well-being, things like their nutrition, make a really important contribution to how well prepared, if you like, children are for starting school and how well they're able to engage with the experiences they meet at school. So family issues are really important when we're considering what readiness might mean. We then need to look at community readiness. What does it mean for a community to be supporting children's start to school? Well, we can certainly look at the resources that are available within communities. We can look not only at health and sporting, but educational resources. Are there high quality prior to school services available in the local community? How accessible are they? How much engagement do families have with them? We can look at the connections within communities. If you're seeking help in a community, how easy is it to connect with a service that's able to provide that assistance? Or how difficult is it to do that? So what supports and services are available and accessible, including, as I said, high quality prior to school services. Clearly health services are important, and so are things like the safety and the stability of the community. How safe do families and children feel? How comfortable do they feel? How much of a sense of belonging do they feel in the community? How much do they invest in the community? And how much does the community invest in them? Okay, so the last of the elements of the readiness equation relates to ready schools. And I often find this a really interesting approach to explore, because very often when we're having those conversations with parents about, is the child ready for school, we often don't turn it around and ask, well, is the school ready for the child? And yet it's just as important to look at how that might be the case. So there are some characteristics of ready schools that are important to consider. One is, what sort of programs do they provide? What sort of supports are available for children in the school? And I'd put transition programs in that same category. Does the school actively engage in promoting transition? How does it do it? How does it outreach? How does it engage? Ready schools are also responsive to the children they have entering school. So when you're having conversations with those employed and teachers who work in ready schools, you're often hearing things like, well, how can we adapt our environment to cope with the children we're going to receive? How can we make them feel comfortable? How can we encourage a sense of belonging among those children? Rather than, how can we make them fit in to the context we already have? So that responsiveness is really important. We also know that ready schools have quality programs to support teaching and learning. They are about promoting quality teaching and learning for all kids and for all teachers. We know that ready schools support professional development for teachers, and that's not always easy, but they're encouraging teachers to think about, to critique, to learn, to engage, to promote their different ways of teaching and learning. We know that ready schools also promote family engagement and the recognition that that looks different for different families, that some families are most comfortable engaging in some ways than others. So family engagement in all its diversity is promoted. We know that ready schools are adaptable, and that adaptability is supported by strong leadership. And I really want to emphasise that leadership is really, really important. Strong leadership can promote flexibility, it can promote a focus and recognition on the strengths and needs of the school community. It basically is a recognition that the community around the school is really important and the school needs to be responsive, as well as sometimes to actually lead what's happening in that area. Ready schools have high but realistic expectations for everyone. They also promote collaborative relationships, particularly among school, family and community. And we've had the pleasure of working in a number of communities where Ready schools and, if you like, Ready early childhood services have had really strong and productive relationships. And it's really clear that they're working together to promote the well-being of children as they start school. So Ready schools have a really important part to play when we consider what it means for someone or some group of children to be ready for school. Okay, so there's a lot of information there, and it's probably more than you needed on each of those slides, but what do we take from it? Well, there's a number of things that I'd like to suggest that are really important to take from it. Like, first couple are in the form of some quotes. The US researchers Kagan and Rigby concluded that school readiness does not reside solely in the child, but reflects the environments in which children find themselves. Sam Meisels, also talking about the experience in the US, talks about readiness as a process that occurs over time and is not complete by the first day of kindergarten. Now, I realise that the first year of school is not always called kindergarten across Australia, but substitute the first year of school for kindergarten and you get the gist of that quote. One of the conclusions there is that readiness is not just about what happens in the lead up to school. What happens at school itself has a major impact on how we regard children's readiness. In a similar vein, children might be ready for one school but not ready for another. They might be ready and start to feel comfortable in the local school where their brothers or sisters or aunts or uncles or cousins actually go, but they might not feel ready to travel for an hour on the bus to go to the school in the nearest biggest town. They might be ready for a school where they feel like they know what's going to happen, but they might not be ready for one that's totally unfamiliar. So we're starting, I hope, to build the picture that readiness is contextual. Sometimes it's really nice to go back at what you've already written and think, yeah, I still really agree with that. I found this nice quote that Bob Perry and I had actually, from something we'd written in 2002, and I quite liked it, so I've included it. It's the conclusion that readiness is more than a checklist of skills and contextually isolated knowledge, and more than a set of behaviours that enable a child to be regarded as compliant in the classroom. Rather, readiness must be conceptualised as a broad construct that incorporates all aspects of a child's life that contribute directly to that child's ability to learn. I recall some of our very early work when we asked teachers and parents and children about what was important as they started school. Just about all of the groups, the majority of respondents in all of the groups, seemed to have the view that what was important was that the child was able to adjust. Very rarely did we have any conversations with teachers or parents who talked about other levels of adjustment. This quote, I think, reminds us that there's a lot happening as children start school, and it's not all down to them in terms of how they present as ready or not. In fact, the argument I'd like to make is that readiness is an interplay between children, family, community and educational elements, and that can be demonstrated in different ways in different contexts. But I will take it to the next step and say, well, I believe that there are different elements of readiness that contribute to experiences of transition. And it's at this point that I want to move from that conversation about readiness to start thinking about what I conceive as the broader concept of transition. Transition is a really interesting term. We use it in just about all facets of life. In our own lives, in our adult lives, we talk about going through different transitions. And we draw on the really broad definition of transitions as being times when individuals change their role in a community. In educational transitions, we focus on times when there is a change in roles within an educational community. Now, using that really broad definition, every time a child changes grade in a school, when they move from year 2 to year 3, for example, they would be going through a transition because they'd be changing their role. Teachers, as they change and teach different grades, would be undergoing a transition. If you think about it as changing our role in a particular community, then many of us experience transitions in many different situations. A couple of things that I think it's really important to preface this discussion about transition. The work that Bob Perry and our team of really interesting and great people have been involved in talks about transition as being embedded within social contexts. So transition occurs in social contexts, and we see transition enacted through relationships and interactions. And I'm really going to come back to that focus on relationships. Relationships are crucial to building supportive transitions. I also want to talk about transition as a process where there's some lead-in, there's a change, and a period of adjustment or management. And perhaps it's useful to think at this time about transitions in terms of employment. When each of us as adults, for example, have been looking to start a new job or to change jobs. If we're applying for a job, there's generally some lead-in, some preparation that we might need to do. There's some thinking about that particular job. If we're successful, we start that job. So there's a change. We actually start a new job. But that's not the end of it. The first day of a new job isn't really a point where we can say we've made a transition. There's an afterwards period of management and adjustment that is required. And again, if you think about your own jobs and your employment, sometimes it takes a while for you to feel really comfortable in a role. Sometimes you never feel really comfortable in that role, and sometimes it can happen really quickly. But if it helps you think about transition as a process, it's not just about what happens before you start a job. Transition to school is not just about what happens for children before school. It's not just about what happens on the first day of that new job or the first day of school. It also includes that period afterwards as you make adjustments and you manage the changed circumstance. So transition is not about an assessment, it's about a process. And really importantly, when we're talking about transition to school, it's not just a transition for children. Families make a transition, schools make a transition, school teachers make a transition, prior to school teachers make a transition. We all experience some lead-in, some change, and a period of adjustment as we look at the changing roles in that educational community. So transition as a process, I think, is really what I want to highlight there. That notion of transition as a process is reflected in a wide range of work, and some of Bob Pianta's work particularly highlights that in this sort of quote. The notion that a child's transition to school is understood in terms of the influence of contexts, the family, the classroom, the community, and the connections among these contexts, such as the family-school relationships at any given time and across time. So what's really important are the relationships that are formed and how those work to support the experiences of transition. There is a range of information available around transition, and I'm hoping that as I put up this slide that at least the image of the cover of the transition, the continuity of learning resource, looks familiar to people. I've included in the presentation a web link to that resource because it's freely available online and you can download it without any drama, as long as you've got, of course, the bandwidth to be able to do that. But the transition, the continuity of learning resource to support effective transition to school and school-aged care presents the results of a delightful time spent visiting services and talking to parents and teachers and children across the country and having them willing to share some of their experiences of transition and ways in which they've managed it. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at it if you haven't yet had the chance to do so. I'm hoping you're also familiar with the Transition to School position statement. And again, the web link will be included in the presentation, so you can have a look at that online and download it as well. The Transition to School position statement came out of a fairly intensive seminar workshop with a number of international transition to school researchers, as well as some of the people involved in Australia in some really interesting research around transition. And part of the role of the position statement was to try and shift some of the focus away from an intense focus on readiness, if you like, to that process of transition. And to try and highlight how, if we start to think about transition as a process, we can see how each of us, as different stakeholders, has a really interesting and important role to play. It talks about opening up our discussions about transition in a really broad sense to focus on that process. Instead of talking about transition as a time when we assess a child's skills or look at what adjustments need to be made, the Transition to School position statement invites us to think about transition to school not in terms of knowledge or understanding or domains of learning, but to think in terms of these four elements. To think about transition to school as a time of opportunity, as a time of aspiration, as a time of expectation, and a time of entitlement. And I've used there on the slide the actual logos that are used in the Continuity of Learning resource to try and highlight these different elements that are important in transition. But a little bit of explanation about what might be involved. In looking through the position statement, it's urging people to think about, well, what opportunities are created by transition? What aspirations do people have? What do people hope for, wish for, desire at the time of transition to school? What expectations do people have? What do people expect will happen? And how do those expectations guide our behaviour? And finally, to think about what entitlements might be involved. What rights, provisions, or what power do people have? And I'm using the really generic term people here because I'm referring to all stakeholders in the process, to children, to families, to educators, to communities, and even to school systems in a sense. All have a role to play in promoting positive transitions. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time giving some examples. These come from the position statement, and some of you may have already been able to use them in really interesting ways in your transition approaches. As an example, if we think about transition as a time of opportunity, we can identify it as a time of opportunity for educators to build relationships, not only with children, but with families and other communities. I think that should say among and other communities that provide the basis for effective and learning and teaching interactions. So, for example, how does transition provide an opportunity for prior to school teachers and school teachers to get together? How does it provide an opportunity in a community to bring together other professionals who focus on early childhood learning and development? How do we use transition as a time to build really interesting relationships with families that are likely to be ongoing and supportive throughout the whole education years? Not forgetting relationships with children. Educators have been doing some really creative and interesting examples, if you like, of ways to get to know children before they start school and ways to promote children's relationships with each other. So there's opportunities for relationship building. What opportunities, we would ask, are there in transition for communities to recognise that it's a really significant event in the lives of children and families? And there are a number of communities around Australia that have community celebrations, really marking this as an important time for children as well as for families and schools. So what opportunities are there in transition? What aspirations are there? Again, many of you who work with children probably won't be surprised that children have all sorts of aspirations when they go to school. They certainly expect to be big and to be regarded as big, but one of the main aspirations they have is that they really look forward to making friends, and they also aspire to learning at school. They know that's why you go to school. In all of the work that we've done with families, we know that families look forward to positive educational outcomes for their children. They want both social and academic outcomes, but they're really looking forward to how going to school can help children attain those. And we also know that educators have aspirations, and many of them have aspirations to work towards professional partnerships that create strong and supportive educational environments for all children. So they aspire to having really strong professional working relationships. Expectations are interesting. Children actually expect school to be difficult sometimes. They expect to learn and they expect to face challenges, but they also expect to be with friends and they expect to have support from responsive adults. So they expect to learn, but they expect the teacher to help them. Families have an expectation that their knowledge is recognised and respected. They expect to contribute to their children's education and to work in partnership with educators. And while that might look different for different families in different contexts, it's really important that that knowledge and expertise is recognised. Educators expect to have support and appropriate professional recognition as they create positive learning and teaching environments, as they engage in partnership with the families and other educators and professionals. And again, in many communities where transition is a really interesting focus of early years educators, there are some great examples where teachers in school settings and teachers in prior to school settings have a really strong professional relationship where they respect each other's work, they recognise it as different, but they respect what each brings to the conversation around transition. And that's a really important asset in that community. The final element talked about in the position statement is about entitlements. And it's a very clear setting out of the notions that children, regardless of where they are, regardless of who they are, have the entitlement of accessing high-quality education that demonstrates respect for their existing competencies, their cultural heritage and their histories. So they are entitled to the best education that we as a nation can actually provide. We know that families are entitled to demonstrate confidence that their children will access that really high-quality education, that education that promotes equity and excellence and that attends to the well-being of all children. And we know that educators are entitled to professional regard and ongoing professional support. We as a nation need to be really supportive and positive about our educators who are working really hard to deliver that high quality education. But we also need to give them the support, the professional development, the professional backing, if you like, to enable them to continue to do that. So they're the four elements, and in looking at the position statement, we're really urging people to say, well, when we're looking about transition to school, what can we do? What can we do that looks at opportunities, aspirations, expectations and entitlements? How can we form the relationships and the interactions that support all of those things at this really important time in a child's life? And as I said, there are many communities around the country who are doing really exciting things in ways that reflect different elements. I want just to highlight something that sometimes goes under the radar a little bit. Many of the conversations we have with people and many of the documents we see that talk about transition focus on promoting a smooth transition. And I think that's a really admirable aim, but I also think we can unpack it a little bit and start to work out what that might mean. Because the very nature of a transition is that it involves change. And one of the questions we need to ask is, well, in trying to promote a smooth transition, are we devaluing the nature of that change and the importance of that change for children? Children, when we've talked to them, have talked with excitement about starting school, even though there might also be a little bit of anxiety. And part of what they're excited about is joining that club of big kids. And that means they expect to feel different and to be treated differently. We know that what they're looking for is a bit of a balance, if you like, between familiarity and challenge. They've told us time and again that the last thing they want or expect school to be like is just the same as preschool. When we start to think about what a smooth transition might be, it's really important to ask ourselves what we mean by that. What is it that we want to be smooth? How do we want to support them? And in trying to do that, how can we recognise that children, all of us indeed, feel a sense of mastery when we manage something that's a little bit challenging? How can we encourage children to face challenge and to meet challenge with our support? What are the implications of seeking to remove change and challenge from transitions? Are we actually helping children develop a sense of resilience and competence at dealing with transition if we take away all the bumps along the way? Now, I really don't want to sound like we should be making transition difficult, but I think there's a sense of saying, how do we recognise that children do change and make a change as they start school? How can we recognise the effort and the achievement they gain from having managed that in many ways? In that same notion, we often talk about continuity, and we talk about the importance of promoting continuity as children start school. But again, I think it'll be really important to unpack that. What do we mean by continuity, and what sorts of continuity do we want to promote? Do we want to promote curriculum continuity? Do we expect that prior to school and school curriculum should be the same? Or can we find some alignment that we find acceptable? Do we want pedagogical continuity? Do we want to be using the same approaches to teaching and learning in prior to school settings as in school? Do we want philosophical continuity? Do we want a sense that we should be thinking or drawing on the same philosophical orientations across the settings? Do we want physical continuity? Do we want prior to school settings and school settings to be in the same physical location? And does that itself promote continuity? Do we want organisational continuity? Do we want the same organisation to be responsible for prior to school and school services? And that's a bit aligned with administrative continuity. What sort of continuity might that promote? Do we want continuity of professional relationships? Do we want continuity of support? Well, the one I'm going to push in the next slide is the notion of continuity of professional relationships, because I believe we've got a really committed range of educators in both prior to school and school settings, and I believe that when they come together and work together, all sorts of things are possible. I believe that if we can promote continuity of professional relationships that are based on collaboration, professional respect, we can create a shared vision for supporting children and families, we can generate new pedagogies and approaches, and we can support each other as we continually engage in critical reflection. Because it's that critical reflection in many ways that keeps us questioning what we do, encouraging us to look for new opportunities, expectations, aspirations and entitlements, and basically keeps reminding us that just because we've had a transition program for years doesn't mean that the same children are experiencing that transition program. One of the exciting things about transitions research is that there are always new children starting school. There are always new families experiencing that transition for their children to school for the very first time. And each and every one of them deserves our full attention and regard because it's a unique experience for them. We need to really focus on how we can best support them. And that's what I'd be encouraging people to do, because there's already a great deal of that happening in many different communities. There are exciting approaches that people are generating from getting together and sharing those professional relationships. To me, that's the essence of a transition, the idea that we can draw on support for all stakeholders and we can look at the possibilities. It's why I prefer to think about transition rather than some of the negative elements that we often hear about readiness, where we're seen to make an assessment about children's readiness in particular, and that informs all sorts of things that we do, and maybe it doesn't always encourage us to think of the most positive issues and ideas. I think I'm reading the panel that says there are a range of questions coming in. I'm going to finish at this point, and hand over to Fran, and hopefully we can start to have some of that conversation and discussion about some of your questions. The last slide just includes some references, so when you actually get the presentation, you'll be able to see that. So at that point, thank you, Fran. It's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue. I'm hoping that my microphone is working and people can hear me. We do have a few questions that have come through from the audience, and I may ask some myself at the end, Sue, if I get an opportunity to. Someone, Petri, has asked the question whether you could talk about the balance between allowing children to be and actually preparing them for the next step. And I guess the next step is making the transition either to school or another educational setting.
It's an interesting question, and I sort of think it could be a really interesting philosophical question. I'll take one way of looking at it, and I apologise if this is not the way the questioner intended it. But to me, it's almost like, do we just let children, do we not engage or interfere, if you like, with what children are choosing to do, or do we try and offer some guidance and direction? And I think there's a bit of both in that for me. I think there is an essence of letting children be and not forcing something upon them, but I also think there's lots of potential for adults to have really meaningful and engaging conversations and interactions with children around starting school. And I think there's an important balance, because the last thing we want to do is make everything in the last few months of prior to school settings, if you like, about going to school, because there is life outside that. But there is also a sense of starting to have some interesting conversations. There is lots of opportunities that we've seen in different communities for people to introduce notions of starting school and to allow children to take up issues that are of interest. In the continuity of learning resource, for example, in one community, they have a delightful going to school book where children are able to share their experiences, draw a picture, paste a photo, ask a question. And there's no one forcing children to engage with that, but if they're interested, they can go and pursue it and have a look and follow it up. So I think there's a really important balance with not controlling children's lives and making everything about starting school, but being aware that sometimes there's an interest that you might need to stimulate, but you can be responsive to children on the way. I hope that answers it, but I'm sure the questioner will let us know if it doesn't quite.
Thanks, Sue. There are a number of questions that more or less focus on the issue of how do we work with schools to be more prepared for the children that they receive, or have some pedagogical continuity with early childhood settings, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because sometimes the focus is on educators in prior to school settings working on transition programs and almost delivering, if you like, kids to school. And yet many schools are also quite proactive in reaching out to prior to school settings. One of the strategies that seems to work well in a number of communities is the idea of having networks that might start around a particular topic like transition to school, but might also continue on as they engage with different topics and areas. I think it's really important to get people in a community, first of all, to actually know each other. And it might sound surprising, but fairly often educators in prior to school settings and educators in schools don't always know who the other is, and they haven't always had a chance to work out what it is that the other does. So my starting point would be to say, how can we get people together? How can we get people together to talk about what it is they do, what's important to them, and then how can we get people to start recognising what happens in the other setting? So I think it's a really important aim to have both schools ready for children and to recognise what happens in early childhood settings, but we're unlikely to do that unless we do some of the preparation work, and that is starting to build relationships and connections. A network might be a good way to do that. In other communities, prior to school settings invite the first year of school teachers to spend some time with them in their setting. And again, it's getting to know what happens. It's starting to have those discussions about, well, you know, we do it this way. I know you do it a different way. what's the reason behind that, and is there any common ground that we can find? So I think it, to me, is again about building relationships, and that's a long-term process, not a quick one.
And so there are a number of questions here about how to support parents being involved in that process. Do you have any viewpoints on that? Are there other ways that educators need to do that, or communities need to do that?
Again, it will vary in different communities and different contexts, but there's no reason that parents can't be involved in planning the transition program. In some cases, parents would actually run the transition program. So there's nothing to say that parents can't have a really important role. And part of the reason that is important is that sometimes the child making the transition to school is the main focus, but we also need to remember that families are making a transition at that time as well. So parents are undergoing changes. They're experiencing different relationships, different expectations. So involving parents in the transition process can be a really important avenue. And again, some parents will be thrilled with that. Some people don't necessarily want that high level of engagement. But there are lots of ways to involve parents. Some of them involve sharing information. Some of them involve seeking advice. In one community a few years ago, parents decided to survey each other and find out what it was that was working and what it was that wasn't working, and think about how they could change it. So if we respect parents as educators in their own right in many ways, then we'll involve them in transition planning and programs in really interesting ways.
So another participant has wondered if there are any documented case studies that you would hold up as exemplars of transition to school or school readiness approaches.
I probably go to the Continuity of Learning resource, and what we've been able to share in that resource are a number of narratives that reflect effective practice in particular contexts. I'd be really loath to say that any one strategy or practice or approach will work everywhere for everyone every time, but the narratives in that resource hopefully highlight some possibilities, and again can start conversations that might say, well, we can't do it exactly like that, but I wonder if we could try doing something similar in our local community. So in a sense, they're not case studies because they're not that in-depth, but they do try and show a range of different possibilities, and they might be a useful starting point if you're looking at exemplary practice.
So this is a more sort of high-level policy question, but we do have a very interesting question here about what your thoughts might be on the AEDC data as a measure of school readiness.
I think the AEDC is interesting, and I think it's a really useful set of data if we remember what it is. It's a community-based measure of readiness. It's not an individual-based measure. So I think it can be a really useful resource to look at some of those community issues about readiness, if you like. So what's happening in the community that supports children? One of the reasons I quite like the AEDC is because it's not an individual measure. So it's not about singling out particular children. It's about saying, well, as a community, how are we managing our resources for children? So I think it can be really useful as long as we remember that it's not about individual children. So if you have a child starting school from a particular AEDC collection district, you can't say, look, all of the children coming from that area will be like this. It's a group measure, and if we use it as that, it's a really important resource. We get ourselves, I think, into trouble when we start to categorise or have expectations about children from particular areas based on that general population measure. So that's my broad answer.
Okay, thanks, Sue. There are two questions here which are kind of opposite ends of the spectrum but happening in different parts of the country. One is what your perspectives might be on people choosing to hold their child back a year before school, and the other, of course, is the move in Tasmania to get children to commence school at 3.
Yeah, they are pretty much opposites, aren't they? Let's take the first one about age. I think that's a really interesting question, and again, I'd be loath to say that there's a really blanket answer. I think you've got to look at the child in context, and that's where that notion of children being ready for one school or one type of school might who might also not be ready for a different type of school. Perhaps I can give an example. In some conversations in previous years, we've talked with parents whose child is age eligible, happens to be a boy, which is usually the case in discussions about keeping kids back. Child was age eligible. Parent was very happy with how the child was learning and developing, but knew that the local school had very high academic standards and had almost a belief, if you like, among the teachers, a well-established belief that children should start school older rather than earlier. And despite feeling quite comfortable with how the child was progressing, this family made the decision to keep the child in preschool for an extra year because they didn't want the child to feel out of place and didn't want expectations that were unrealistic to be afforded to that particular child. Now, in that case, I would have said, actually, if the child is age eligible and everything is fine, then why would you keep the child out of school? But I think that's where you have to look at context. My broad response to age eligibility would be to ask the question right up, why would you not send the child to school? Is there a particular reason that you would hold the child out? If there is a particular reason, okay, well, let's manage it. But if there's not a really good reason, then why would you deny the child access to what is supposed to be a good education? And I think the other broad response I'd have to that question is, well, rather than trying to keep children out of school, I'd really like to focus on making school the best it can possibly be for children, and making it an inclusive setting rather than an exclusive setting. I know that that's might be a challenge, but my focus would be not on keeping kids out, but making sure that when they get to school, they have the best possible experience. In terms of starting school at age 3 in Tasmania, I think that's a really interesting notion. And my response would be, well, it depends what school looks like at age 3. There are some advantages to having preschool aligned with a school system. Those advantages are often about seeing prior to school education as being a really important part of the bigger picture. So actually increased status and recognition, if you like, of the power of early learning. But my concern would be if it turns into another year or two of school. I think one of the great advantages of prior to school settings is that they often have greater flexibility and responsiveness, and I'd really like to see that continue. I wouldn't like to start to think of another couple of years of school. But like I said, there often are advantages in incorporating prior to school settings with a broader education system. Let's just see what develops. I think there are also some pitfalls that we might want to guard against, but who knows just yet.
So following from that, there are two dissimilar questions, but they do flow on from your answer. One participant has asked what your perspective might be on the co-location of schools and early childhood programs. And the other question, so we've only got a little bit of time, so maybe you can pick which one of these you want to answer, is what can you do if a child has to go to school due to their age, but you're concerned about how they'll cope socially and emotionally?
Okay. I'll try and do both, but quickly. Co-location can be fantastic. It also can be make no real difference. I'm sure we all know situations where there are co-located services and there are really nice connections between those who work in prior to school and school settings, and there are probably also settings where you might have staff at the early childhood service who have nothing to do with the primary school teachers, and that can be because of things like different timetables, different times that the kids and the families come and leave, and all sorts of things. So co-location can work really well, but the mere physical presence of an early childhood service in a school in the same area isn't enough to make it work well. Somebody still needs to drive it. Somebody still needs to work on building the connections and making them work. It's not enough just to have the physical presence, you actually need to have the engagement. And in terms of the child who is required to go to school because of age, and you're concerned about them, I think there are interesting roles there where those who surround the child can have really important a really important impact. So the child, yes, might have to go to school, but hopefully there's at least, you know, the parents, the family, the prior to school and the school teacher who might be able to work together to support that child, who can think about ways to do really simple things like connect kids with each other. So this child is going to school next year. Who else might be going to the same school? Who can we start to form connections with? Are there some ways we can get to know the setting and start to realise what's going on? So I think the working together can build a web of support, and in many ways it's that support that I would be really keen to see move from the prior to school to the school sector. So I think the other important thing there is to almost have belief and trust in the child, in a sense. Children are remarkable in many ways, and they often show us that they're much more capable than we expect. I would think that if we trust the child and follow their lead and provide a web of support, we might even be pleasantly surprised. And if we demonstrate that we expect them to do well, funnily enough, they probably will. So I'm sorry, they're a bit short on both, but there you go.
So that seems to emphasise that the transition process starts a long time before school starts, the first day of school.
Oh, very much, yeah. If you look at some of the US work, they're basically saying transition starts from birth. I'm not quite sure I want to go that far, but there is a sense that transition is a cumulative set of experiences, if you like, over time that lead you to a particular point. So, yeah, transition does start a long way before the first day of school. It can start when you start to have conversations with children about school, when you start to think about what school they're going to and who they'll be going with and how you might organise it. For children with special needs, thinking about the transition to school starts really early in the piece, when parents are particularly keen to find a school that's most appropriate for their child. So, yeah, transition is a process, and for many families and children and educators, it starts well and truly before the first day of school. And most importantly, it doesn't the first day of school. And if I can just make a link there back to the EYLF and that notion of belonging, in our approach to transition, we would say that transition doesn't conclude until there is a sense of belonging in that new community. And that could take some time, and it could look different for different people. But until there's a sense that children feel and parents feel and the educator feel that they all belong in that community, then there's a way to go in transition.
Thanks, Sue. We have loads more questions, but unfortunately it's now 3 o'clock. But I'm sure everybody has really appreciated both your presentation, which was very informative, and your answers to the questions that were posed, and my apologies to all those other wonderful questions that are up on the question pane that we haven't got around to. Is there anything that you'd like to say, Sue, before we bring the webinar to a close?
No, I mean, it's a nice indulgence to be able to sit here for an hour and talk about something that I think is really important. I'm quite privileged to think that other people are also working really hard about transition, and I think some recognition that there are lots of really interesting things happen, and people are trying really hard and putting a lot of effort into planning transitions approaches that are really positive. Congratulations to you all, and I only encourage you to keep working on it.
Thanks, Sue. Thank you, everyone. That brings our webinar to a close. We thank you all for attending. We hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. A recording of the webinar and the presentation slides will soon be available on the ARACY website. If you're interested in the work of the Early Years chapter and would like to be a part of it, you can also visit the ARACY website for more information. The chapter is led by Barb Wellesley and a national committee with representatives from each state and territory. We recently released our inaugural newsletter, and keep an eye out for upcoming blogs, posts and other webinars that we're trying to get organised. For other ARACY events, visit the ARACY website. There are various one-day training events around Australia on the Common Approach. I'd like to thank Sue and the organisers who have done a marvellous job at getting some of us technophobic people on the webinar okay. Thanks once again to Sue and all the attendees for your time. Goodbye, and we hope we can catch up again with another webinar. Thank you.